Before we talk about how the various temptations of Humphrey Van Weyden almost killing Wolf Larsen, let's discuss a little bit more about what they discuss. Maud ends up quoting a poem called Impenitentia Ultima, right? And basically, right, if you look at, right, Impenitentia Ultima, right, we see that at the root of it, right, we see the root word for penance, right, sorrow or making up for one's sins, right? Doing penance is right, doing good works to make up for one's sins. And ultima, right, is just to say ultimate, right? So if we wanted to translate it into English, the closest thing we could say is we could say basically ultimate impenitence, right? Impenitence, right? And so he's not repentant, right? So because right, he will not ever be a penitent, right? It's basically to say to never have remorse, right? Is basically, the more common way, is ultimate refusal of remorse, right? No guilt, no conscience, no saying I'm sorry, no apology, right? And this idea, of course, is excellent for Wolf Larsen. He feels very much the same way about how a human being should behave. And he also ends up quoting the most famous epic poem that was written in English, right? We mentioned the Odyssey, which is another epic poem, but that was written in Greek. There's not too many great epic poems that have been written in English, but there was one called Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost, it's an epic poem by the English poet named John Milton, right? And the poem Paradise Lost is twofold. It's about the fall of the angels. So it's about the war in heaven, right, where Lucifer and a third of the angels try to overthrow God in heaven. And then it's also about the fall of man, right? Meaning like the temptation in the garden and Adam and Eve being corrupted by the seduction, by the temptation of Lucifer on earth. And so this makes sense that they're having a discussion about this because they're having a discussion about this general idea of temptation, right? And one of the most important quotes in Paradise Lost is the most famous, is when Lucifer famously says, "It is better to reign," that means to rule, right, to govern. "It is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." And this is by far the most famous quote from Milton's Paradise Lost. And it's the general idea that someone would often rather suffer and live a life of torment as long as they could be in charge, as long as they could keep their individualism, as long as they can keep their sense of self-mastery, right? No one is my master. I am my own master. And this, of course, makes sense, this idea of ultimate unrepentance, right? This is all coming to an end. And the reason why all of this, right, and she even, Maud even refers to Wolf Larsen as a Lucifer, right, which it literally means the bright star, right, because we noticed that, by the way, Lucifer is also the term for the altar boys who carry the candles into Mass, the light bearer, right, because that's all Lucifer means. It just means the light bringer, right, the proud one. And the idea of this is we're basically kind of seeing that in the end, Wolf Larsen is this way. He's ultimately self-serving. He's all about himself. He's full of pride. He wants to be the one in charge. He doesn't want to follow anyone's rules. He doesn't want anyone to be his master other than himself. And he says that this night, right, Van Weyden remarks that this night, Van Weyden is more voluble, right? That just means excessive talking, right? He just won't shut up, right? Like this is the one night when they're at dinner, because normally, right, Hump and Maud will do most of the literary talking, but not tonight. Captain Larsen is the one doing all the talking because he's talking about things that he enjoys, temptation and pride, and it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And he refers to Lucifer as the first anarchist, right? That just means against rule, against government, against order, right? And this makes sense for what Wolf Larsen is, right? We talked about how he keeps being described as the perfect type of the primitive man, right? Who would live in a world that is, dog eat dog, right? It makes sense that, right, every man for himself, the wild scramble violence of nature, right? This is what the great philosopher Thomas Hobbes referred to as the state of nature, where it's just the war of man against every man, right? Homo homini lupus, right? Uh, Man is to man a wolf, right? The idea of everyone kind of scrambling and fighting and clawing for survival against each other, right? For Wolf Larsen to live in this kind of environment, that's what he would love. That's what he would love to exist. On the contrary, what Maud and Humphrey argue about temptation and natural impulses is that just because, right, you fan a flame, this is the analogy he uses, to fan a flame, meaning if you give it air, right, that can make a flame bigger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the flame will pass from one object to another. Fanning the flames is how you can spread a fire. But just because you fan a flame, right, just because the fire is being moved does not mean it moves from one location to another. And that is the analogy that it uses. It's an interesting analogy, but one of the things that it shows the flaws in the way that Maud and Humphrey do philosophy is that because they argue from sentiment and emotion and from images and from poetic examples, right, they have difficulty articulating precisely what they mean in terms that are plain and simple, right? I mean, the problem with their arguments against temptation is that they can only make arguments by analogy. They have difficulty actually saying, well, no, temptation comes from without. And Wolf Larsen could say, prove it, right? Like, how does a desire not come from within? And so they argue by analogy, but it's very difficult. This is one of the interesting things about when you do argue about things of the soul, right? And the difficulty about arguing about things of the soul is not something that can be directly observed or measured, right? And therefore, how can you prove it with concrete examples, right? And so they argue by analogy, but when you're ultimately talking about the soul, right? And this shows the kind of limits of philosophy and religion, because they're always trying to understand these very deep mysteries that are not always easily expressed scientifically or directly, or talked about with something that can be measured. Does temptation come from within, or does it come from without? This is an interesting question, and it's basically ultimately a question about materialism, right? If materialism is true, then all feelings and all desires we would have can come from within, but they can also be provoked from the outside. And this brings us to what happens next in the plot, which is one of those amazing things that happen in the plot. After dinner, Humphrey awakens in the middle of the night because he hears something going on in the next room. And what he hears going on in the next room is the regrettable sight of Wolf Larsen attempting to rape Maud Brewster. And apparently it's just started because it doesn't seem like they've gotten any clothes off at this point. And at this point, Hump attacks Wolf Larsen. He doesn't attack him very easily, and Wolf throws him through a door right after that happens. And then as he tries to attack him again, this time with his knife, right, his dirk, right, just to remember if you don't remember what that's called, the dirk, he attacks him. And what happens is, and it has nothing to do with Humphrey and his knife, all of a sudden he has this tremendous headache and he's clutching at his head and he's all of a sudden in agonizing pain. So in the middle of the attack, with Humphrey trying to fend him off and Maud trying to fend him off and Humphrey using his knife, all of a sudden Wolf Larsen just has this ultimate migraine headache and he's not able to function. He basically falls down. He falls over in agonizing pain. And one of the interesting things about this is that earlier when they were discussing Paradise Lost, right, is he said that Lucifer, right, would keep going unafraid of the god of thunder. Right? So basically he's saying it doesn't Lucifer would keep being himself even though God would strike him down, right? And interestingly enough, throughout the text, right, when Wolf Larson has choked Humphrey Van Weyden, he'll be like, "Is your God going to save you now? Where's your soul? What's going on?" But finally, we have a situation, and we notice that Larson has been having headaches throughout the text. Finally, he's in the middle of doing something terrible, and it's almost as if he's been struck down in the middle of the act. And Humphrey stabs him on the shoulder blade, or he stabs him and hits the back of the shoulder blade. But he can stab him again. But this comes from the kind of the key idea about the question about whether temptation comes from within or without. After Wolf Larson is weak, and after he's not able to defend himself, because of all of the things that Wolf Larson has done, all of the shaming, all of the torture he's put Humphrey through, he is ready to stab him to death in that moment. He is totally in his power in that moment. And that's when Maud, in spite of the fact that he just tried to rape her, screams out for Humphrey, "Stop, for my sake, don't do it," right? And he even says, like, "I would kill him for your sake," right? Like, he tried to rape you. Like, I will absolutely destroy this man for what he had tried to do. But she appeals to him by kind of his sense of morality, his sense of dignity, not to kill him. And so the question about temptation, and this really kind of gets to the argument, right? Does, if because we could argue, if temptation is real, does, I can't seem to type. Does Hump stop because Maud gives a greater pull, right? Meaning, does she, with her, is his desire to please her, right? A greater pull, meaning a stronger pull of desire, or does she simply remind him of who he is? Like, this is not who you are. Don't do this because this is not who you are. So does the source of him stopping, does it happen because she just reminds Humphrey of who he is and that he's not a person who would kill, who would murder? And that would be more the idea of kind of like Wolf Larson's materialist argument. Or is it true that sometimes there can be these desires that come from without, right? That there's some influence that comes from without. So interestingly enough, by yielding to Maud, it would seem that it shows that one can be tempted from the outside, right? But at the same time, one could also argue that all she has done is simply remind him of who he really is and what he would really want. So it's kind of a complex situation. But the key idea is that he doesn't kill him. And now that he is all of a sudden helpless and everybody else seems to be asleep because everyone's half drunk, he relieves Louis, who's at the wheel. He lowers the sails, right? He makes it so that the boat won't go anywhere while everyone's asleep and while the captain is completely helpless. He basically then says, all right, well, now's our chance to escape. It is now or never. And that is actually then what they are going to do, right? They are going to take the moment to escape. They lower a boat. They take as many blankets and food, and he kind of knows where Japan is. It's about 600 miles from where they are. And now they are getting in one of those little boats. They hope they don't encounter any stormy weather, and they are going to try to make their escape. And so that's the overall plot, and that's kind of the greater all things. And in the final section, we're going to talk about some of the meanings and some of the symbolism that is being used in the chapter.